lecture series. For those of you who have not had the pleasure of meeting, I'm Warren Vanderhill, University's Provost. And our speaker today is David Dabydeen, writer and professor of literary studies at the Center for British and Comparative Cultural Studies at the University of Warwick in Coventry, England. A citizen of Guyana and the United Kingdom, Professor Dabydeen has held academic positions at Warwick since 1984 as lecturer, senior lecturer, reader, and professor. And those of you who know the pecking order of British academe know that's the way you do it, compared to assistant associate and full professor in the United States. He began his academic career as a fellow at Yale's Center for British Art and as a junior research fellow at Wolfson College, Oxford. A prolific writer, he has published in the last 15 years at least 4 novels, 3 collections of poetry, and 7 works of nonfiction. Among his poetry collections are Slave Song, Cooley Odyssey, and Turner, the most recent published in 1994. His latest work of fiction is A Harlot's Progress, which came out last year following closely upon the novel The Counting House. Along with his creative writings, he has edited important books of nonfiction, which include Early Black Writers in Britain, A Handbook for Teaching Caribbean Literature, and Across the Dark Waters, Ethnicity and Indian Identity in the Caribbean. For this work, Professor Dabydeen has received several awards, including the Cambridge University Poet Couch Prize, the Commonwealth Poetry Prize, and the Guyana Literature Prize. But I want to add, in addition to his academic work, Mr. Dabydeen has held international posts, including memberships on the Executive Board of UNESCO and the Board of the United Nations Intergovernmental Program for the Development of Communication. Presently, he is also Ambassador at Large for Guyana and Guyana's Ambassador to Permanent Delegate for UNESCO. This month, as some of the audience know, he is on a college and university tour in the United States, which includes Valparaiso University and Goshen College here in Indiana, and St. Michael's College in Burlington, Vermont. And I'm certainly very, very delighted that my colleagues here in the faculty were able to get him to come to accept our invitation to present today's lecture. I particularly want to thank Dr. Adele King, Professor of Modern Languages and Classics, who is here, along with her husband Bruce, for their efforts in making this visit possible. And I'm also grateful to Dr. Paul Ranieri, chair of our English department, and to Bob Nowatzki, a faculty member in that department, for their assistance with the on-campus itinerary. It's now my great pleasure to present Professor David Dabydeen, who will speak on the topic, the Nobel Prize for Literature 1992, Derek Walcott, and the Triumph of West Indian Writing. Professor Dabydeen.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me at the back? Well, I'm very grateful for the opportunity of being here. And I'd like to, at the outset, to thank my very close friends, Bruce and Adele King, for the opportunity of speaking to you. What I will do is say something in the first half, and I wouldn't delay you for too long, on Derek Walcott and the development of West Indian literature. And then in the second half, since I'm here as a writer, I will talk about my own small contribution to this body of writing. Now, the life and work of Derek Walcott cannot be separated from the place of his birth, which is St. Lucia. All my work has been about this island, my love of it, my love of its people. He told St. Lucians gathered to greet him when he returned home after receiving the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1992, the year which was the 500th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the region. Now, St. Lucia, for those who know St. Lucia, is a tiny dot of an island in the Caribbean Sea. Without modern navigational aids, the British Airways pilot could easily overfly it and end up in the continent of South America. Of course, Columbus himself had taken the wrong turning, and instead of getting to India, he'd arrived at another place which he christened West India, and christened its natives Indians. But it's this tiny dot of an island. As you fly and you see sort of patches of sugarcane, sort of banana fields, goats wandering around in sort of backyards. And you think of Naipaul's ideas about unfinished societies. And yet you suddenly realize that in the last 20 years, St. Lucia has given the world 2 Nobel Prize winners. In 1980, Arthur Lewis was awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics. Imagine coming from a country without an economy I'm getting the Nobel Prize for Economics. And of course, in 1992, Derek Walcott receives the Nobel Prize for Literature. Now, this really, these awards, and don't forget, St. Lucia has about 100,000 people, smaller than Ball State. I don't know whether you've produced a couple of Nobel Prize winners in the last 20 years, but I think this achievement really testifies to the creativity of West Indian peoples, their ability to transcend the limitations of their histories, and to create fantastically out of the little at their disposal. Derek Walcott won the Nobel Prize in the 500th anniversary of Columbus's journey to the region is a tribute to the genius of the individual poet, but also a recognition of the genius of West Indian peoples who survived the shaping forces of slavery, indentureship, and colonial exploitation. Now, Derek Walcott's talent is individual, but not solitary. The region has produced writers of international acclaim, novelists like Jean Rhys and V.S. Naipaul, who are considered to be two of the finest writers of English prose. And of course, the French and Spanish-speaking Caribbean have produced phenomenal talents, such as St. John Pierce from Guadeloupe, who himself received the Nobel Prize in 1960, and more famously to maybe an American readership, Gabriel Marquez, the Nobel Prize laureate for literature in 1982. Now, what are the sources of the creativity that produces people like Walcott? I think of two things primarily. Firstly, the nature of the region, the character of the region. I know that we think of the Caribbean as a place where we just laze on the beaches and go for the blue waters, but the character of the region is fantastic. It's a unique experiment characterized by fantastic survivals, hybridities, and amalgamations. It's a complex mixture of Amerindians, Africans, Asians, and Europeans living together with the varied legacies left by the Spanish, the English, the French, the Portuguese, and the Dutch colonizers. Now, Derek Walcott's poetry absorbs and recreates in his individual voice the cross-cultural sources of Caribbean expressivity. In Salman Rushdie's words, he quotes, blends classical, Caribbean, and African rhythms into a music all of its own. Caribbean history, which is largely one of being estranged from the past, exiled from ancestral home and memory, has not been a source of grievance to Walcott, but of creativity. He put it memorably in his Nobel speech when he said, break a vase, and the love that reassembles the fragments is stronger than that love which took its symmetry for granted when it was whole. It is such a love that reassembles our African and Asiatic fragments, the cracked heirlooms whose restoration shows its white scars. This gathering of broken pieces is the care and pain of the Antilles. And if the pieces are disparate, ill-fitting, they contain more pain than their original sculpture, those icons and sacred vessels taken for granted in their ancestral places. Antillean art is this restoration of our shattered histories, our shards of vocabulary, our archipelago becoming a synonym for pieces broken off from the original continent. The second source of Walcott's genius is the sea. Walcott is our great poet of the sea, and again I quote him, if you live in a rock in Barbuda, you are really in an immense sea and in an immense sky. And that vertical figure of the individual person is within larger elements of physical feeling. So the tinier the island, the more powerful the islander's sense of being pivotal to the two immensities of sea and sky. And this explains to me the epic nature of Walcott's poetry, its restless and anguished quest for the sacred and for the infinite. To write of the sea is also to write of the Middle Passage, the epic journeys made by millions of Africans and Asians in the dread conditions of slave and coolie boats. It is within the frail vessel or craft of poetry that Walcott has redeemed such people from the status of degraded victim and unit of commerce by giving them human voice and human presence. Finally, to write of the sea is to enter into a body of literature dating back to the biblical story of the Ark and to the Homeric Odyssey. Migration is real and literary. Make of my heart an arc, he writes in his book of poems, Another Life, confessing to the poet's sacred duty of taking to other shores descriptions of Caribbean myth, ritual, living landscape, and human presence. And in his monumental poem, Omeros, Walcott writes of the coincidence of migration and the crafting of poetry. There are two journeys in every Odyssey, one on worried water, the other crouched and motionless without noise. For both, the eye is a mast. A desk is a raft for one, foaming with paper, and dipping the beak of a pen in its foam, while an actual craft carries the other to cities where people speak a different language or look at him differently. The sea has crafted Walcott's poetry in a literary, but also in a literal way. Speaking of his poetic drama, The Odyssey, he says, quote, "The rhythm of the Odyssey is the meter of the lift and dip of oars going into water. I come from a cultural context where rowing was a daily act." Attention to the craft of poetry, the craft of the sea, is the substance of Walcott's genius. It has separated him from those who have used poetry merely as a vehicle for protest, with little understanding of the struggle to gauge the length and weight of a line, or the alchemy involved in converting base metal into rich metaphor. Walcott has made poetry that is sensuous, lyrical, and astonishingly beautiful. Language has been his abiding concern, the breaking and remaking of it to express with imaginative depth the awesomeness of the familiar. When you read Walcott, you think of Shelley's definition of poetry as the stripping away of the veil of familiarity to lay bare the naked and the sleeping beauty. Such concern with the potential of language to revive within us a sense of awe and beauty and love has also alienated Walcott from certain kinds of literary criticism. In his brilliant essay, Caligula's Horse, he castigates postmodernist critics for using ugly, jargon-laden language, but also for degutting poetry for its ideological content. The intellectual games that critics play are substitutes for sensitive and creative responses to literature and betray an ignorance of the formal properties and craft of writing. And of course, referring to the French school of deconstruction, to its arrogance and self-referentiality, he writes, quote, "It convinces one that Onan was a Frenchman." If I had to give you one simple example of the progression of West Indian literature from a state of, from minority status, if you like, to a major achievement, it would be Walcott himself saying that at the beginning of his career, he could not use the word mango in his poetry for fear of alienating reader and publisher alike. Of course, it's hard to find a rhyme for mango anyway. Yes? What he meant, of course, was that the certain fruits, like the cherry or the peach or the apple, have sacred, iconic status in English literature, but not the banana, and not the mango. I don't think the lychee either. So imagine if you, let me just quote you Houseman's Shropshire Lad. "Loveliest of trees, the cherry now is hung with bloom along the bough." Now imagine you put a banana in there. "Loveliest of trees, the banana now is hung with," it doesn't work. So, but this ability to name landscape, to name landscape and to define the region of the culture of his region, the character of his region, unapologetically and unashamedly, and in fact quite brilliantly, has been the achievement. The movement from the inability to use the word mango in poetry to Walcott's full-blown Caribbean epics. Now, Walcott, of course, is not as I said earlier, not an individual talent, but also he belongs to a community of writers. And I just want to spend a few minutes telling you about these other writers. Walcott's Omeros is dedicated to, quote, shipmates in the craft. The craft being not only the craft of poetry, but also, as I said, the slave and coolie boats which brought us to the Caribbean from the days of Elizabeth I and eventually landed us in England in the days of Elizabeth II. After the Second World War, West Indians were recruited to Britain to help rebuild its fabric, to work in hospitals, factories, railways, and bus services. And among the mass of workers arriving in the boats were a few prospective writers, people of Walcott's generation, Walcott's friends and colleagues. There were James Berry and Edward Brathwaite, Sam Sullivan and George Lamming, Andrew Salkey and Michael Anthony, Stuart Hall and V.S. Naipaul, Jan Carew and Wilson Harris, an all-male lineup. These early writers, coming in different boats and from different islands, shared Walcott's passion to name self and to name landscape. The Trinidadian Sam Sullivan said, quote, "I believe that the West Indian novelist had among his major responsibilities that of making his country and his people known accurately to the rest of the world being, of course, England." When Naipaul began to publish, C.L.R. James wrote to him to congratulate him for, quote, "showing the English what stuff we are made of." Now, literary efforts at self-definition and self-description coincided with agitation for independence and decolonization. Some writers like Martin Carter and Roger Mace were jailed in the Caribbean for opposition to Britain, and their poetry and fiction were nourished by political and prison experiences. And others like C.L.R. James wrote fiction, history, and political philosophy, and worked closely with up-and-coming anti-colonial leaders, politicians like Jomo Kenyatta and Kwame Nkrumah, for the liquidization of colonialism and imperialism. But most of the writers who emerged in the 1960s, however, had no direct personal involvement in political movements. They came to Britain to write poetry and fiction, not political tracts. They confessed a passionate and obsessive ambition to write works of the imagination, none more so than the Guyanese Edgar Mittelholzer. Mittelholzer, who's a Guyanese of German extraction, uses the language of war in describing his efforts to write and to be published. I quote from his autobiography, quote, in my imagination, in those days, you see, you had to send your stuff to London to be published. You packaged it up, you sent it off, you waited, because there were no airplanes, you went in a boat, you waited, you sweated and you suffered. Then the rejections come back, then you send it again, right? So he said, in my imagination, the whole thing had taken on the flavor of a military campaign. I was a general at the head of an army, and the objectives were clearly defined. The enemy was life, editors and publishers in London. I must hurl the whole weight of my war machine against their defenses, infiltrate here and there, and then in one big offensive, batter away at the inner fortifications until victory was achieved. The acceptance of a short story by a weekly paper would constitute a mere infiltration. The same would apply to an article, but a full-length story accepted by one of the monthly magazines, like The Strand, Pearson's, or The Royal, would be a major breakthrough. Final victory would be represented by the acceptance of a novel by a publisher. Mittelholzer wrote furiously and copiously and posted from British Guyana several stories to English magazines, only to receive rejection slips and the return of his manuscripts on the separate cover. The more he was repulsed, the more fanatical he became, penning stories for speedy dispatch to the metropolis. Quote, every time I looked in the newspaper and saw that a ship was due from England, I had to steel myself for an enemy onslaught. When I heard the postman dismount from his bicycle at the gateway, I knew it was 0 hour. The bulky envelopes meant another repulse. Disheartening, but that was war. Attack again. Back went the manuscripts to other editors. Sometimes 3 or 4 went off at the same time, for I never stopped writing in the intervals of waiting to hear about those dispatched. No one guessed what a grim struggle was being waged. I presented a blank face to the outside world. I went to ice cream matinees and danced as though I was a carefree young man. These were days of great innocence. I went to an ice cream matinee and danced as though I was a carefree young man, not yet settled in any special occupation. Only I could hear the artillery booming in the background, sometimes drowning out the wailing of the saxophone and the cling-clang of the piano. Anyway, Mittelholzer eventually published, and published enormous quantities of novels. And at one stage in England in the late 50s, Mittelholzer was probably the best-selling novelist in the English language. He published about 30 novels, 35 novels, and then killed himself. But what I'm trying to say is that to be a writer, you had to be validated by the centre, and you had to be in the lists of the London publisher. To remain in the Caribbean was to languish in obscurity, and indeed to quote self-annihilation. Sam Selvin himself says he could easily have dissipated his life in beach parties, rum drinking, and middle-class flirtations if he didn't come to London to write. Finally, it had to be said too that in the West Indies, the writer was deemed to be a kind of a lunatic, one with no prospects of a decent house, a decent marriage, and a decent situation in society. Why did one want to write when the thing to do was to become a lawyer, a doctor, a civil servant? There is a character in Naipaul's Miguel Street called B. Wordsworth, B for black, because he imitates himself and W. Wordsworth, white Wordsworth. So B. Wordsworth is seen as an idler and an eccentric, one who will never get anywhere with his life because of his unworldly literary ambitions. And of course, in any case, being black, Trinidadian society automatically believes him to be lacking in talent. This is colonial Trinidad. His ambitions, therefore, are seen to be even more ludicrous. He's doomed to rejection and to penury. And here is a little passage between B. Wordsworth, the poet, and a little boy who follows him, almost like a disciple. He pulled out a printed sheet from his hip pocket and said, "On this paper is the greatest poem about mothers, and I'm going to sell it to you at a bargain price for 4 cents. I went inside and I said, "Ma, you want to buy a poetry for 4 cents? My mother said, "Tell that blasted man to haul his tail away from my yard, you hear?" I said to B. Wordsworth, "My mother says she ain't have 4 cents. B. Wordsworth said, "It is the poet's tragedy." In addition, Naipaul is saying that B. Wordsworth, by remaining in Trinidad, is doomed to mimicry. The master script is English, and the colonial writer is shackled to it, perceiving and describing his tropical equatorial landscape in English romanticist images of vales and meadows, rills and purling streams. Colonial brainwashing, the process by which the Ethiop is washed white, means that only such images are acceptable to the Trinidadian reader as authoritative, as proper literature. To find a native voice, the would-be writer has to emigrate away from colonial expectations. And so they boarded the boats. And I just want to tell you a story about 2 of these writers who ended up in the same boat. They were both writing seminal novels, their first novels, and some of the first novels about their society. And they boarded a boat called the SS Empire Windrush. And they were windrushed across the Atlantic. One was called Sam Selvin, and the other was called George Lamming. One came from Trinidad, the other came from Barbados. And they had one typewriter among themselves, and it belonged to Sam Selvin. It was an imperial typewriter. I like the ironies. You know the old imperial typewriters? It belonged to Sam. And Lamming would come to Sam Selvin's cabin and knock and beg and borrow the typewriter, and then he would disappear with it. So he would hide. He would refuse to open his cabin. Selvin would have to go and threaten him with assault. They struggled and quarreled over this typewriter throughout their journey across the Atlantic. And when they arrived in London, they both stayed in the same men's hostel and quarreled again until Lamming brought his own second-hand machine. 10 years after the journey, Lamming wrote lyrically about Selvin's boat journey, depicting him as a solitary, romanticist figure. Quote, "Selvin and I, like members of some secret society, were always together. But this comradeship turned to a strange reticence during the last few days of the journey. Sam had taken to walking alone in the more remote parts of the ship. Sam had taken to walking alone in the more remote parts of the ship. Sometimes he would be seen working in odd corners, a small grey typewriter in his knees, and long black locks of hair fallen forward, almost screening him from view. He would go up on the deck as if no one was there. He would take refuge in a dormitory whenever it was empty. Note the detailed recollection of the typewriter as being small and grey. And the truth was that Selvin was not seeking the solitude of poets on board the ship, but merely trying to put distance between himself and Lamming. So these are the humble beginnings, the truly humble. Of course, Naipaul flew straight to Oxford, but on the whole, these are the humble beginnings of Caribbean literature. a struggle over a typewriter in a boat coming to England. Of course, Walcott himself, his first book of poems was self-published, based in Dylan Thomas's first publication. And of course, Walcott, his first book, self-published, printed in wherever, St. Lucia, sold to his friends, you know. And that's the beginning of that process. That long haul leads to the Nobel Prize in '92. I should say a few more things about Sam Selvin before I end this talk. Selvin was an honorary doctor at my university and a very close friend. He's now dead. He told us all kinds of fantastic stories about being a writer in the 50s. He said, for example, he was slopping out a bar. He was working in a bar. Because all the writers worked for factories, and you know, they worked for factories and they worked for wherever they could get work. Wherever they could get work, they worked, and then they were writing and publishing. Anyway, Sam Selvin is slopping out this bar in Bayswater, which is owned by an erudite Irishman, on a Sunday afternoon, and the Irishman comes in and says, "Sam, I didn't really realize you were a writer. I've just seen your name and a photograph of you and a review of your book in the Sunday Times." So Sam said, you know, continued his work and just ran out as soon as he could and bought 250 copies of the Sunday Times and read them all. But but that is a true story. You know, the humility of the beginnings. Sam then said that his publishers, one of the privileges of being a writer is that on publication day you get taken to a very expensive restaurant and you could have anything you like, yes? Except royalties. But, Sam said they took him to this seriously expensive French restaurant and he knew nothing about French, but he recognized the word gâteau. So he ordered it for his main course. And then he said he always remembers the first time the BBC paid him. He said it was a cheque. It was made out in guineas. You know, guineas is the coinage for gentlemen. Gentlemen up to the 1960s, gentlemen and gentlewomen, didn't get paid in plebeian pounds. They got paid in guineas. A guinea was 20 shillings plus one extra shilling, 21 shillings. It was named after the slave. It was named after Guinea, the coast of Guinea, and slave gold. Anyway, that irony didn't bother Selvin. He was just glad for his damn guineas, right? Forget slavery. I just want my guinea. But they paid him in guineas, and he said it was a big, thick piece of paper that the BBC had used for the cheque, you know. And then it said BBC, you know, pay Samuel Selvin 18 guineas, signed by the controller of the BBC. He said he was very poor, but he kept the cheque for quite a while to sort of nourish the sense of being a writer that he'd arrived. So these are some of the things that have kept me, in a sense, these are some of the things that have kept me going as a writer. The sense of belonging to a tradition that is venerable and a tradition that has achieved enormously in terms of literary descriptions, not just of the Caribbean, but of the West. What is Omeros but Homer looking at the world from the other side of the telescope? Now, I have not really been working on the Caribbean recently. I've been working in 18th century England, because in a sense, to be a Caribbean writer, you have to take it back to your origins, and our origins lie in the 18th century. So I just want to say a few brief words about the 18th century and why it is that for the last 15 years or so, I've been living in the 18th century to such an extent that my friends and family tell me to get a life. I mean, I've just published a book called A Harlot's Progress. I know Bruce thinks it's autobiographical, but it's not. Which is based on a set of Hogarth paintings in 1732, and I've published a couple of books on William Hogarth. But why I like the 18th century, briefly, is the paradox that the idea of progress is a very strong idea in the 18th century. You get it celebrated in poems like Alexander Pope's Windsor Forest, you know, the sense of a long emergence from the sort of darkness of the, if you like, the jungle, of the darkness of an agricultural background into urbanity, or into the condition of the city. So you get the idea of progress celebrated in poems like Windsor Forest. You get the idea of mercantile progress, the sense of the the merchant as the engine and catalyst of growth, and especially urban growth. You get that celebrated in poems like Edward Young's The Merchant. You have the scientific progress being celebrated in great poems like Thomson's The Seasons, where there's a kind of celebration of Newtonian physics and the way that Newton had mapped out the movement of the heavens. You know that Newton was also profoundly obsessed with alchemy. So whilst he was doing all his scientific work, he was utterly obsessed with alchemy. This strange thing about Newton. Anyway, and yet, whilst these ideas of progress are being celebrated, you have some of the most terrifying visions of the destruction of the world and the end of the world in 18th century writing. Something profoundly eschatological. You know, you get, for example, Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, where a few fleas can erode a whole civilization and wipe out archives and historical memory. You get a fantastic print, a fairly unknown print by William Hogarth in 1764 called Bathos, where the whole of the universe collapses, where the sun explodes, where Father Time just lies decrepit on the ground, where time itself has ceased, broken clocks, broken brooms, the whole of civilization is broken. This was his last print before he died, Bathos. Or you get at a much more humane level, less iconic level, iconographic level, you get what must be one of the most wonderful pieces of 18th century literature, writing, Fielding's Journal to Lisbon. If you haven't read it, do go and read it, which is about a man. We know he's dying. He doesn't know he's dying, but we've read the book 200 years later, we know he died. He's going to Lisbon to recuperate, and he just writes about the small irritations in his way, from the boatman insisting on getting more money to the lack of salt in his food, you know. And these small things build up to a sense of the end of the world, very much like Death in Venice. I'm sure that Death in Venice was in some ways model in Fielding, though I don't think scholars have picked that up. And of course the end of the Dunciad. You can't better that for darkness. Thy hand, great anarch, makes the curtain fall, and universal darkness buries all. I mean, you can't progress on that level of eschatology. And yet at the same time, the eschatological and the eschatological. What attracts me as well, I must admit, about the 18th century are the dead puppies and the sluggish gutters and the syphilitic prostitutes and the taverns and the dens, and, you know. I mean, I did write this novel, and I did have some nice time exploring the sewers of 18th century London through the safe pages of Gay and Pope and so on. But it is, you know, there is a sense of a kind of gin-sodden life. So I always think that there's a profound religious vision that emerges, that is either mired in, a profound religious vision mired in or emerging from the kind of sense of filth and the sense of flesh. So I love the paradox of the 18th century, the eschatological and eschatological. But for me, and I'll end on this point, the greatest paradox is it was the age of the dictionary, and it was the age of slavery. It was the age when the word was being defined, fixed, citizenship. The English were purifying the language from the tribe, as it were. And this fixture and definition of language was bound up with a sense of nationhood. You know that the word was very important. There are magazines dedicated to the elegance of the word, magazines like the Tatler. The form, the most popular form of painting in the first half of the 18th century is the conversation piece, where ladies and gentlemen of civility and money sat round and discussed, talked, and drank tea and were served by servants, but they sat and talked, the conversation piece. And of course, Pope's definition of true wit, which is at the heart of poetry, is what's oft been thought, but ne'er so well expressed. So expression is everything. Now, whilst all this is going on, you get the most astonishing descriptions of Africans, and later on Indians, as being linguistically incompetent and ungrammatical and, in fact, disabled. In other words, they don't have language. And their barbarism is in fact premised on the fact that they don't have language. I just quote you very briefly from The Spectator in May 1712, describing Africans as, quote, barbarians, who are in every respect scarce 1 degree above brutes, having no language among them, but a confused gabble, which is neither well understood by themselves or others. So that kind of linguistic definition of the barbarian, and of course the word barbarian itself means to speak like a foreigner. You know, he who didn't speak Greek and later on Roman was a barbarian. I always think of this, and there's nothing surprising that people should be defined as barbarians linguistically and sometimes killed. Do you remember I have this quotation from my favorite passage from the Bible, the book of Judges chapter 12, when the Ephraimites are slain in their thousands. Do you remember this passage? When the Ephraimites are slain in their thousands by the Gileadites, because of their inability to pronounce a syllable. And the Gileadites took the fords of the Jordan against the Ephraimites. And when any of the fugitives of Ephraim said, "Let me go over," the men of Gilead said to him, "Are you an Ephraimite?" When he said no, they said to him, "Then say Shibboleth." And he said, "Sibboleth," for he could not pronounce it right. Then they seized him and slew him at the fords of the Jordan. And there fell at that time 42,000 of the Ephraimites. So the word shibboleth, which of course is now passed into common usage and now means a test word or opinion or principle, the use or inability to use revealing one's party or nationality or orthodoxy, that term shibboleth, the whole passage signify to us our words can include or banish people from protective society. Words can validate or can exterminate them. I will end with this paradox of slavery and the age of the dictionary. Throws up beautiful puns. I mean, I use the word beautiful ironically. The word patron, for example. I'll end on this note. The word patron in the 18th century meant support of the arts. Somebody who was part of high civilization. But the word patron also meant as a corruption of the word patroon, owner of slaves. So it had this wonderful dual meaning, patron. And of course in the 18th century, old masters, I'm sorry if I'm talking to 18th century people, but old masters were not called old masters, they were called black masters because of the grime that accreted on, that accumulated in religious paintings. They were called black masters. So there you have the patrons who were owners of black masters and owners of black slaves. Wonderful. I love these. As a writer, I don't care for the grievances of history, what Walcott calls the long groan of history. Well, what survives really is, for me anyway, is the artistry, the puns, the language. And I will end really by just saying that I do really passionately believe that after all the horrors and the tragedies of history, after all the tyrants have come and gone, what will remain of all this dread would probably be the art that commemorated it. In a few centuries hence, when we would have forgotten this tragedy or that tragedy, when it's slavery, in 500 years' time, imagine the Holocaust will be forgotten. When the tyrants have come and gone, when all these tragedies have been forgotten, when Ozymandias, and do you know who Ozymandias was? And do you care? Yes? When Ozymandias topples in the oblivion of desert sands, is all that remains the sculptor's gift in shaping the tyrant's cruel face. And of course, Shelley's sonnet, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them in the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and snare of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped in these lifeless things." Thank you.
Professor Dabydeen has graciously consented to take questions and comments. We have some time, so please ask whatever might occur to you.
Walcott was obviously highly appreciated when he received the Nobel Prize. But you had mentioned that one of his goals was to let his country be known accurately by the rest of the world. And yet he could write about the moon.
Mhm.
Did he succeed?
Sorry, did he what?
Did he succeed?
Well, Walcott, you mean?
Yes.
Walcott, of course, yes. I mean, the great epics. I mean, we should talk to Bruce King, who's just finished Walcott's biography. But Walcott is, as Brodsky says, well, Brodsky says the finest writer in the English language, but these are silly. Sorry. I'm just saying that you should direct the question to Bruce King, who's just finished writing Walcott's biography. Of course, yes, Walcott is now considered to be one of two or three of the great living poets in the English language. And he was able, as I said, to, well, I mean, there's a lot of luscious tropical fruit in his writing now. Sea grapes, crabs, mangoes. No, but, you know, his latest collection, Tiapolo's Hound, which is being published, I think, in a month's time, if you read it, will answer your question.
I see a new crop of potential Caribbean greats coming out these days?
It's very difficult because there is a generation of writers to whom I belong who are, in a sense, oppressed by the achievements of our literary ancestors. I mean, how can you write about the sea like Walcott? If I write about the sea now, I mean, Walcott just booms in my mind, you know. If I write about the Amerindian rainforest, it's Wilson Harris territory, you know. Naipaul has also carved out for himself a certain space. So in a sense, we are probably second division. I don't know whether you know we're probably in the second division. You know, these are the Premier League people, you know, and we have to, in some ways, crawl out from under the shadow of the rock, as it were, right? You know, and then we're exposed insects. I don't know. I don't think that we've produced yet anything that can compare to some of the great works of Brathwaite or Walcott or Naipaul or Jean Rhys, you know. But it's you know, we're all trying it out. We're all scribbling away violently. But it's a bit like Eliot. After Eliot, there was no poetry really for 20 years, you know. There wasn't good poetry after Eliot. Some people say there'd be nothing good in the 20th century after Eliot, you know. You know, somebody snatches, somebody of enormous giftedness leaves another person with a sense of literary impotence.
It's a soccer reference for those of you who don't follow British football. Other questions, comments, please? Yeah.
I wonder if you could tell us the trajectory of literature from the Caribbean and also other art forms, in particular music, and the reception of music of that area in the current world.
Yes, I was in, I think it was Estonia, one of those republics. And there was a bar playing Bob Marley, reggae, in Estonia, or was it Lithuania? I think it was Lithuania, one of those places, yeah? One of those, you know, places just been opened up and sorted an airport out. Bob Marley in Lithuania, or maybe Estonia. Maybe they could hear it in Estonia. It was being played so loudly. But of course, music always travels. Music is, well, I mean, the cliche, it's a truism, it's universal. Literature, well, you know what I mean. Literature is much more considered. It demands a kind of a introspection, a certain care when it's approached. It doesn't necessarily translate properly, you know. So Caribbean culture, unfortunately, is represented by reggae and by grass skirt limbo dancing people, and by crab races and all the stupidity that happens on the beach, you know. Walcott says, if you want to know Caribbean history, look for it in the pages of the sea, because most of our history took place in the sea, the great sea battles for little islands. But of course, we're just obsessed with the beach. When I say we've converted the place into a tourist brothel. you know. As Cuba probably will become again in 20 years' time, alas, because the Spanish are already doing their sex tours there. Now, I'm not saying I've got anything against sex, you know, but I'm saying that unfortunately, the Caribbean is not represented, except among the literary people or the intelligentsia. It's not represented by Walcott. Though ultimately all societies, long after everything has perished, are known by their writers. You think of Malaysia, you think of Somerset Maugham, you know. You think of the Belgian Congo, you think of Conrad. So the writing eventually will fix a region or a country. But at the moment, it's the tawdry Bob Marley. Not that I've got anything against Bob Marley either, but you know. One of the finest lines in Caribbean poetry is by a song by Bob Marley, when he talks about poverty, and he says, my feet is my only carriage. Beautiful line, carriage and feet, you know.
I'm thinking, talking about that, in the process, sort of Marley gets to learn a lot of interesting things. There's now a restaurant in Florida that's kind of Bob Marley's theme restaurant. Right? So Bob Marley becomes Good Times on the Beach, which if you listen to the music, it's not.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, what happens kind of to the meaning of people like Selvan, you know, when they begin to move? You know, what does a text like Lonely Londoners start to mean?
And
Good times and women in London? Or?
no, I don't. You see, to read a novel, you have to have this imaginative depth yourself. So, in a sense, people are not going to be reading Sam Sullivan in the way they listen to Bob Marley. You know, say in England, you know, people put on the Bob Marley, they get a little spliff, and they turn the lights down, and they're subcultural for a couple of hours, right? You know? They're slumming it, right? Now, I don't see myself anything. I would never have a moralistic attitude to the fact that Bob Marley has become a restaurant, or indeed in Jamaica, Nat Turner. Nat Turner, who was a 19th century rebel, there's now a kind of Nat Turner Square. Not Nat Turner. There's another Turner, not Tina Turner, another one. There was a slave rebel in the 19th century Jamaica. It was Nat Turner, yeah. So there's a Nat Turner restaurant and stuff. Now, you see, there is, as Walcott keeps saying in the Caribbean, a constant process of renewal. And he links that to the sea. The sea keeps washing and cleansing the land, yes? There's a constant process of renewal. And it seems to me that if we have in the Caribbean an ability to convert our history into comedy, and sometimes into kind of absurdity, that in itself could be seen as a gift. For example, Naipaul says that the word revolution is a big word, but only because it's a big word, because it's a big idea, and it can only take place in big societies. Revolution. He said, look at Grenada. Remember Grenada? He said, I went to Grenada, and all along the road were painted up the Revo, up the Revo. You know, people had shortened the word revolution to revo. And they were going around saying, up the revo, bro. Right? And Naipaul pours scorn on that, yeah? Because he said, you know, they had to shorten the word because it's a smaller society. But quite the opposite. What it is that these people are taking this big word, which is pregnant with all kinds of blood and tragedies and its own associations, and creolized it and made it homely, you know. No less potent, but they creolized it and made it fit their own conditions in the way that the creolization of language is exactly that, making the English language, transforming the English language so you can bear the weight of your own experiences. So I see nothing, I mean, I quite like the idea of, you know, this cleansing that goes on, whereby history becomes absurd after a while, so that Nat Turner can be seen in a different light.
Could you talk a little bit about where C.L.R. James fits into this grouping of writers? What is that?
James was the first. James was a pioneer in terms of writing history, writing fiction, and writing politics. You know, I mean, there was a time when the literature was deeply immersed in political movements, when the literature was inseparable from the fight for independence. And James was one of those early writers who was able to combine the three activities. He published one of the first novels, Minty Alley, in the Caribbean. Of course, he comes from a middle-class literary background. You know, he himself said that he didn't read, he didn't learn about literature sitting under a mango tree. He said, you know, I read the New York Times, and all these books were being brought to our house, you know. But no, he was an extraordinary man. He himself said that in one of his essays, he talks about the insider and the outsider, you know, and the privilege of being an outsider, but yet at the same time being inside. He says, you look at all the great writers of our century, Eliot, Pound, etc., Yeats, Beckett, they're all not Beckett, Yeats, they're all outsiders. They're Irish, but they're English. And he says the same with the West Indian. Of course, he was speaking about himself, because he was able to write powerfully about cricket as the condition, not of a game, but as a condition of order and civilization. But yeah, he's a fascinating. There's an American scholar called Neil Lazarus who's just published a book on post-colonialism that has a chapter on James, arguing that James is one of the major Marxist theorists of our times.
Yeah, Bruce?
This may not be answerable, but perhaps you give me your thoughts on this. It seems to me that so much work has been done recently on the Caribbean experience and discovery of but there's very little attention given to Indian history, Indian itself, towards from the 19th century onwards. Indian two members of Parliament, people from Sri Lanka, who were part of the literary world. These are people who are well known very often. There's history there, and nobody seems to pay any attention to it. It's been totally ignored. And history starts again with Africans who come in the 18th century. And then there's a big gap. The next generation in the 1930s. But there's a continuous history of minority cultures within and people who are actually part of society. Why is that ignored? Why is that?
Yeah, I don't think it's been ignored. I think, Bruce, what it is that people are queuing up. People are in a queue to tell their histories. First of all, it was the West Indians, because they got there first, right? So their story is being told now. And then it's the Asians. And when they tell their story, my God, they got a lot of resources behind them as well. You know, like, we scratched around in archives on next to nothing to dig up a few facts and figures. But when the Asians start writing their history, they've got computers, they've got a hell of a lot of money, and it's going to overwhelm us, you know. But no, that history is being written up now. You know, there are scholars like Rosina Vishwam, I could sort of, you know, mention Sukhdev Sandhu. There's work being done now on the history of Asians in this country, which, as you said, goes back in Britain, which goes back at least 300 years. Yes, and there's a whole body of art, 18th century art, which has the Indian figure. You know, the iconography of the Indian in English art is yet to be studied.
Other questions? David, thank you very, very much for being our guest.
Pleasure.
Thanks for all those who helped make this possible. I really appreciate this.